Hello again, Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here, continuing our series on attacking the king, looking at fundamental checkmate patterns. Today we're looking at Anderssen's Mate, and this one focuses on the pawn structure where the g-pawn has been misplaced. Now I think we all know that the g-pawn starts out on g7, where we would have a nice wall of pawns in front of our king in the traditional castled position. Also, sometimes the g-pawn will march forward one square up here into g6, and that would give us our fianchetto position. Oftentimes, black will place their dark squared bishop here amongst the pawns, protecting the weak darkened squares that happens whenever the g-pawn moves forward. Hopefully you can see that if the g-pawn was on its normal square, that it would protect the dark squares in front of the king. And whenever it moves, whether it's to the traditional fianchettoed spot or to a completely advanced position here, you can see that it's not protecting these important dark colored squares. Now, once the g-pawn has advanced quite a ways forward, the weakness that it really provides is access for white's light squared bishop to attack the f7 square. If we had a fianchettoed position, then the attack of this bishop would be blunted at the head of the pawn chain. Let's take a quick peek at, kind of compare this to a previous mating pattern we looked at called Lollis Mate. If you're not familiar with Lollis Mate, check out our video on that one. But this is an example of Lollis Mate. Lollis Mate attacks the fianchettoed position where the dark squared bishop is missing, which creates a weakness of dark squares in black's position. And this is a variation of Lollis Mate where they're using a bishop instead of a pawn. And the idea here is that we have total control in black's position because this pawn has moved. And so if you remember from Lollis Mate, we can sacrifice a rook here, and if he takes, we check, and then you can see how the bishop and the rook work together well to create a checkmate in the fianchettoed position. If you take that back a couple of moves, what if black ignores this rook and simply moves his rook out of the way to try and create a runaway square? It doesn't matter because, again, the way that the bishop and the rook work together, that is checkmate. So going back to the previous, for Anderssen's Mate, we can see that we don't have this fianchettoed pawn because this pawn has moved forward. This now allows us a totally different kind of attack. So here, if the bishop wants to sacrifice itself, again, bringing the king out, now the queen can come in and have a very similar checkmate. You can see how the bishop is covering that queen and getting in there. So that is the idea of Anderssen's Mate, and you can see that that looks kind of similar to a Lollis Mate. Let's reset that one, entering in with that bishop attacking. It can also happen when the g-pawn is completely absent. It's not marching forward for whatever reason or trying to storm against the king. It's just been traded off and gone. And you can see again how we're attacking this f7 square and how this beautiful bishop on f6 is attacking squares inside of black's castled position. So here again we sacrifice with the bishop. Once the king comes out, the queen comes in, and we see that same pattern again with the queen and the bishop getting support and causing checkmate. So let's take a look at a game of how can we create a position where the g-pawn has been misplaced or missing. Are we simply waiting for our opponent to make a mistake that we can capitalize on? Or is there a way that we can force them to misplace their pawn? Let's take a look. This game only lasts 11 moves. It's incredibly short. What a fast win. This is Blom versus Jensen in 1934, and poor Jensen made some key mistakes right out of the beginning. So the French defense, very popular defense, okay. Knight c3, very traditional. The other popular option is the advanced variation, where we simply close the position. Capturing is very normal, and we see this knight. We want to keep an eye on him in the center of the board. Developing the bishop, developing our bishop. Take notice that the bishop on d3 is very common whenever white has an opportunity to attack the h7 square here. We really want to do that. And black decides to maneuver his knight out to e7 instead of the more traditional f6 placement. Not certain what Blom was wanting to do here, but this is a great move by white in response to that. Bishop to g5, protected by the knight, pinning against the queen. Okay. And black makes a big mistake here. He castles in this position. And you want to remember that this bishop wants to be here, attacking in here, and at the same time with this pawn being removed or misplaced. So can you see a move that would allow that to happen? Pause the video if you need to. White's going to force the misplacing of the g-pawn and getting his bishop into position with check. Check is always forcing. And what's black to do here? Black, I suppose, could move into the corner, but then we have a double attack here on the h7 square. So he takes the offered piece. We get the pawn, and now look at these bishops. We see them attacking. We see the queen from her natural square wanting to come to that h5 square, and we see that these squares have been opened. So the attack is happening. I'm not sure why black moves the queen, but what else could black have done to try and escape? And here comes the sacrifice, the queen, and Anderssen's mate. So we could analyze this game and wonder, well, did black have any hope here outside of moving this queen? Could he have maybe moved his rook to create a space? Could he have maybe brought his knight for an extra defense? That's an analyzation for another day. But right now, we just want to notice that black gave us the opportunity, and we seized it with Anderssen's Mate. Okay, so let's look at a variation of Anderssen's Mate. This is when our pawn gets down here and creates a nail, what we call a nail in the coffin, or whenever a pawn is attacking the castled position, we call it the nail. We can compare that to the original Lollis Mate, which again, watch that video, but the idea here is that as we're pawn storming and bringing our pieces to bear against the castled position, this pawn is simply attacking the g-pawn, hoping to say checkmate, protecting our queen, forcing black to create a fianchettoed pawn structure with the absence of his dark squared bishop. This, of course, gives us the nail in the coffin here. So this pawn is often referred to as the nail. And it allows our queen to come in and cause checkmate. So that's Lolli's checkmate. And if we look at that variation of Anderssen's Mate, we can see that our nail here is in a different position, but still attacking that key square that Anderssen's Mate likes to do. Remember, in Anderssen's Mate, we had a bishop on f6 that was controlling the h8 square. Well, now we have a nail in the position controlling the h8 square. And so the way that we take advantage of this, again, common theme, sacrificing the bishop on h7, drawing the king out. Here comes our rook, and now instead of being defended by the bishop, it's defended by the pawn or the nail, creating checkmate. So we can see this variation in this game, Anderssen versus Zukertort in 1869. Kind of fun that we get to see Anderssen's Mate performed by Anderssen himself. And you can see we have a nail in the position, and boy, oh boy, this passed pawn here with all this support is just wanting to become a queen. But Anderssen has other plans. We can see that this bishop is ready, except there is a pawn in the way. Okay. We can see that these rooks are ready to come over and come into the position. And so it's white's turn to move here. Again, pause the video if you need to, if you'd like to see if you can figure out the move here. I know many of you might have considered moving this pawn forward first, getting ready to sacrifice the bishop. But that move is too slow, and we have to think more forcing and more quickly. So the queen sacrifices first. The king has no choice but to accept the sacrifice. And now we have a discovered check. All we have to do is move this pawn out of the way, and it's going to reveal the attack of this bishop. So once that happens, black has a few options here. If he moves in front of the pawn, then we can sacrifice the bishop, luring him back out again so that we can check him again, forcing him back into the hole, and Anderssen's Mate is complete. Notice how many times we checked the king. We're going to back that up to the beginning here. Forcing moves, checking the king to where they can't do anything else but respond is the key here. Check, has to take. Check, has to respond. Check, has to take. Check, has to respond. Checkmate. So when you're looking at combinations and tactics, understand that check and forcing moves are easier to calculate and can guarantee your position there. This was the final example. I know many of you probably looked at, well, what happens, I suppose, if simply takes the bishop? And that's something for another day that we can analyze, but since he didn't take the bishop, this leads to this mating pattern. Well, I hope Anderssen's Mate is helpful to you in a game where you find that the g-pawn has been misplaced, or if the g-pawn is entirely absent, no g-pawn. If you see that, think about Anderssen's Mate. Think about the bishop having access or having a pawn that is a nail in the position, and see if you can take advantage of that. I hope you're enjoying the Attacking the King series that we're doing here. We're going to have more to come. The way to really get these to start happening in your game is to practice them with a friend, to repeat the positions, to watch these videos, to maneuver the pieces over the board. Remember the handy catchphrase, you are what you repeat. So just keep repeating these motions and you'll start to see them over the board in your own games. Until next time, I'm Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club.